On a quiet morning in western Montana, Ethan Walker climbed into his old pickup truck and drove out toward the southern edge of his land, expecting nothing more than the usual work of checking fences and counting cattle. What he found instead made him stop the engine and simply stare. Where there had once been open grassland and a stretch of quiet brush, there now stood a full luxury pool complex, complete with a sunbathing deck, a fully stocked outdoor bar, and rows of lounge chairs arranged as if they had been there for years. More than 50 residents from the nearby homeowners association were laughing, swimming, and raising glasses of champagne under the late morning sun, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet did not belong to them. When Ethan calmly asked them to leave his property, the woman who introduced herself as the association president only smiled and told him that if he wanted to fight this in court, she would make sure it dragged on for 10 long years. Ethan said nothing in return. He simply turned around, walked back to his truck, and drove away without raising his voice even once. 2 days later, the only road leading out of that hidden resort was sealed shut with a single steel gate, and nobody inside understood yet what that quiet man had just set in motion. Ethan Walker was 45 years old, and to anyone passing through that part of Montana, he looked like nothing more than a modest rancher, living a simple life far removed from wealth or ambition. He owned 2,300 acres of land that had been passed down through 4 generations of his family, stretching across rolling hills, a natural lake, and dense patches of forest that most people never had reason to visit. A wide section along the southern boundary had gone largely untouched for years, since Ethan kept his cattle mostly to the northern pastures where the grass grew thicker and the water ran cleaner through every season. He drove a truck that was older than some of his neighbors' children, wore the same worn jacket through every winter, and repaired his own fences with his own 2 hands rather than hiring anyone to do the work for him. Few people in town realized that the quiet, soft-spoken man buying feed at the local store was sitting on land worth an extraordinary fortune, and Ethan preferred it that way, believing that wealth announced too loudly only invited trouble and envy from strangers who never understood the responsibility that came with it. He had grown up watching his father and grandfather protect that land through droughts, disputes, and hard winters, and he carried their patience and their respect for the law like an inheritance more valuable than the acres themselves, something he intended to pass forward, exactly as it had been given to him. There was a certain rhythm to Ethan's days that outsiders rarely noticed, waking before sunrise, feeding the herd, mending whatever fence line had loosened overnight, and ending each evening on the porch watching the light fade behind the ridge. He rarely spoke about the size of his holdings, and when neighbors occasionally asked, he answered only in vague terms, changing the subject back to weather or cattle prices. That quiet, almost invisible manner of living had convinced most of the county that Ethan Walker was simply another rancher scraping by, a misunderstanding he never bothered to correct, because correcting it had never once benefited him. The southern acres themselves held a particular quiet beauty that few outsiders ever appreciated, a slow, rolling stretch of native grass bordered by scattered cottonwoods and a dry creek bed that only ran full during the spring melt each year. Ethan's grandfather had once told him that the true value of land was never measured in dollars, but in the number of generations willing to protect it without complaint of any kind. That lesson had shaped Ethan into a man who trusted documents over conversation, patience over confrontation, and silence over argument whenever a dispute threatened to disturb the steady rhythm of his otherwise ordinary life. Not far from Ethan's quiet pastures sat Sunrise Canyon Estates, a gated community of newer homes built for families who wanted mountain views without the inconvenience of actual rural living. Victoria Hayes, 42 years old and recently elected president of the Homeowners Association, had grand ambitions for the neighborhood and no shortage of confidence in her own judgment about how those ambitions should be achieved. She wanted a resort-style pool, an elegant clubhouse, and a set of tennis courts that would make Sunrise Canyon the envy of every other development in the county, and she said as much at every single meeting she led from the moment she took office. Her campaign slogan, repeated so often that residents could recite it in their sleep, promised to transform the community into a 5-star retreat rather than just another suburb tucked quietly against the mountains. There was only one problem standing between Victoria and her vision, and that problem was money, since the association's budget could barely cover basic landscaping, let alone an entire private resort. Victoria was the sort of woman who believed obstacles existed only for people who lacked the will to move around them, and she was determined to find a way around this particular obstacle no matter what. It eventually cost anyone else. Those who served alongside her on the board would later describe Victoria as someone who spoke in certainties even when she had no real basis for them, a trait that had carried her far in business, but would soon prove disastrous in matters of land and law. She had built a modest real estate career on confidence alone, closing deals through charm rather than diligence, and she assumed the same approach would work just as well here. It never occurred to her that patience and paperwork mattered more than persuasion when the thing in question was not a handshake deal but a legally recorded boundary line drawn decades before she ever arrived in Montana. Late one evening, while reviewing old property records in the association office, Victoria unrolled a faded map that had clearly not been updated in decades and studied it with the eager eyes of someone hunting for a shortcut. Her gaze settled on a wide, unmarked stretch of land just beyond the southern fence line of the community, an area the map seemed to suggest belonged to no one in particular at all. She traced her finger along the boundary lines again and again, convincing herself with each passing minute that she had stumbled upon a rare and overlooked opportunity nobody else had thought to claim. In her mind, land that appeared abandoned on an old document must simply be land that nobody wanted, and nobody who truly wanted something would have left it looking so neglected and forgotten for so long. She rolled the map back up with a small, satisfied smile, already picturing the pool, the bar, and the applause she would receive at the very next community meeting. It never once occurred to her to check with the county recorder's office, and that single oversight would soon become the first domino in a very long chain of consequences she never saw coming. At the next association meeting, Victoria presented her plan with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a masterpiece, and the room responded with the kind of excitement that made bad decisions feel unanimous and even wise. A contractor she had already contacted assured everyone that the land in question had clearly gone unused for years, pointing to the collapsed fencing and the faded, half-buried sign that once read private property as proof enough for anyone in the room. One resident, more cautious than the rest, asked whether anyone had verified legal ownership before moving forward with construction, and Victoria answered without a moment of hesitation that they should simply begin building first and settle any lingering questions later. She reasoned aloud that county records were poorly digitized, that the old fence had rotted away years earlier, and that whoever once owned that patch of land had clearly stopped caring about it long before her arrival in the neighborhood. Her exact words, remembered later by more than one uncomfortable board member, were that once the pool was built, nobody would have the heart or the money to tear it back down again. With that reasoning alone, the association approved a budget of just over $2 million, and construction crews were scheduled to begin within the week without a single legal review completed beforehand. A handful of residents raised quiet concerns in private conversations afterward, wondering aloud whether such a large expenditure deserved more scrutiny before ground was ever broken. Those concerns, however, were gently dismissed in follow-up emails from the board, assurances that everything had been properly reviewed, and that the association's legal counsel had already signed off on the project. In truth, Mark Dalton had barely glanced at the plans, trusting Victoria's confident description of the land rather than requesting an independent title search of his own. That single missed step, small and unremarkable at the time, would later become the very foundation upon which the entire lawsuit against the association was built. Heavy machinery arrived at dawn a few days later, and the work began with the kind of urgency reserved for projects everyone secretly knew might not survive. Close scrutiny, if examined too carefully. Excavators rolled forward across the grass, tearing up soil far beyond the boundary the old map had suggested, drifting nearly 500 meters past the true property line without a single person noticing or caring enough to check. Surveying stakes were placed by workers who had been told only to follow Victoria's marked plan rather than verify it against any official county record or certified document. Foremen focused entirely on schedules and budgets. Board members focused on design choices for the clubhouse, and not one person paused to ask the simple, obvious question of who actually held the deed to the ground being reshaped beneath their feet. Meanwhile, on the far side of that same boundary, Ethan was occupied entirely with moving his herd toward the northern grazing fields, a routine seasonal task that kept him away from the southern acres for months at a time every year. The machines dug, poured concrete, and built walls in complete silence, hidden from the one man who actually held every legal right to stop them before any of it ever started. 4 months of steady construction transformed that quiet stretch of grassland into something almost unrecognizable, a private resort rising out of land that had never asked to be anything more than pasture for cattle. A sparkling pool now stretched where wild grass once grew, flanked by a fully equipped outdoor bar, changing rooms, a paved parking area, and even underground electrical lines running to a secondary access gate near the tree line. Victoria organized a grand opening celebration, inviting residents, the contractor, board members, and a handful of local acquaintances she hoped would spread word of her considerable achievement. Standing before the crowd with a glass raised high above her head, she declared that this pool would become the shining symbol of everything Sunrise Canyon Estates could someday become, and the crowd answered with enthusiastic applause, and raised glasses of their own. Nobody in that celebration knew, or seemed to care enough to ask, whether the ground beneath their celebration truly belonged to the community at all. Ethan, still tending his cattle far to the north, remained completely unaware that his southern pastures had quietly become someone else's private playground while he was away. Photographs from that opening day later circulated among residents proudly, showing families lounging beside the water and children's floats bobbing gently near the shallow end, though notably, no children ever appeared in any account that followed. Victoria kept one such photograph framed in her office for weeks afterward, a small trophy commemorating what she believed was her greatest achievement as president. She would later remove that same photograph in far less celebratory circumstances, though on that sunny afternoon nothing could have convinced her that any trouble was coming at all. It was not until several weeks later, when Ethan finally rode down toward the southern boundary to check on fence lines he had neglected during calving season, that he saw it for the very first time. From a distance, dozens of bright umbrellas and colorful lounge chairs dotted a landscape that should have held nothing but grass and scattered brush as far as the eye could see. He slowed his truck, stepped down onto the dirt, and walked closer with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man trying to convince himself that his eyes were simply playing tricks on him. They were not playing any tricks at all. A crowd of strangers lounged beside a pool that had somehow appeared on his family's land without a single phone call, letter, or knock at his door beforehand. Ethan stood at the edge of it all for a long moment, saying absolutely nothing, simply absorbing the sheer audacity of what had been built without his knowledge or his consent. For a moment, something like disbelief passed across his face, though it never once turned to anger the way it might have for another man in his position. He thought instead of his grandfather, who had once told him that land disputes were rarely won by the man who shouted loudest, but by the one who understood exactly what the paperwork said. That memory settled over him like a steadying hand, and by the time he took his first step toward the crowd, his composure had already returned completely. When Ethan finally approached the pool area, a hired security guard stepped forward and told him plainly that the space was reserved for residents only, as though Ethan himself were the trespasser, rather than the man standing on his own land. He asked calmly who had built the structure, and it was Victoria herself, who appeared moments later, walking toward him with the easy confidence of someone who had never once questioned her own authority in her life. She informed him with a light laugh that this was homeowners association property, spoken as though the statement alone settled the entire matter beyond any possible debate. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened a mapping application showing county parcel boundaries, holding the screen toward her without raising his voice or losing his temper for even a moment. Victoria glanced at it briefly, waved a dismissive hand through the air, and told him that an application on a phone was not the same thing as actual law in this county. Ethan simply nodded, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and told her quietly that he would be back soon, a promise she mistook entirely for retreat rather than the resolve it actually represented. Victoria watched him walk back toward his truck and allowed herself a small, private moment of satisfaction, convinced that the old rancher had simply been intimidated into backing down without a fight. She had encountered plenty of longtime landowners before, people who grumbled loudly about changes to the neighborhood but ultimately lacked the resources or the will to challenge an organization as established as her association. In her mind, Ethan fit neatly into that same familiar category, a man who owned land but lacked the sophistication or funding to contest anything meaningful inside an actual courtroom. She returned to the celebration, refilled her glass once more, and mentioned casually to a nearby board member that the property dispute, if it could even be called that at all, had already resolved itself in their favor. What she did not know, and could not have imagined, was that Ethan was already dialing a number he trusted completely, a licensed land surveyor named James Miller, who had mapped these hills for decades and understood every inch of the county's true boundaries better than anyone alive. James Miller was 58 years old, a man whose entire career had been built on precision, patience, and an almost stubborn refusal to guess at anything he could instead measure. He had surveyed half the ranches in that county at one point or another, and his signature on a document carried a weight that few lawyers ever bothered to challenge. When Ethan called him that afternoon, James did not ask many questions, simply telling him he would be out first thing the following morning, with everything necessary to settle the matter permanently. James Miller arrived at Ethan's property early the next morning, carrying professional-grade global positioning equipment, 40 years of surveying records, and the original certified plat maps that had defined the Walker family land since it was first registered with the county many decades earlier. He worked methodically for hours, planting markers, cross-referencing satellite coordinates against historical deed descriptions, and comparing every measurement against records that predated even Ethan's own birth by generations. The results left absolutely no room for interpretation or argument of any kind whatsoever. a fact James stated plainly and repeated twice to make certain it was understood. The entire pool complex, along with its bar, its changing rooms, and its parking area, sat squarely within the boundaries of Ethan's legally recorded 2,300 acres, without a single meter of overlap or ambiguity anywhere along the line. James signed and certified his findings on the spot, creating a formal document that would stand up in any courtroom in the entire state without question. When Victoria was informed of the survey results by a nervous board member later that same day, she refused outright to accept them, insisting that professional surveys could sometimes be wrong, and that her association's own attorney would surely find a very different answer. She spent that evening pacing her office, rereading the survey report as though repetition alone might change its findings, then finally called Mark Dalton well past normal business hours, demanding he find some flaw in the document. Mark, tired and reluctant, agreed only to review it in the morning, quietly suspecting even then that no flaw was likely to exist. The association's attorney, a man named Mark Dalton, reviewed the survey the following day and delivered the news to Victoria in far blunter terms than she had hoped or expected to hear from him. He still promised to fight the matter in court on the association's behalf, though he warned the board plainly that litigation could prove both costly and prolonged given the strength of the evidence against them. Victoria, unwilling to admit any mistake publicly in front of the residents who trusted her, instructed him to proceed with legal action against Ethan, regardless of the obvious risk involved. When Mark relayed this decision back to Ethan, expecting some kind of panicked reaction or a hurried settlement offer in response, Ethan instead responded with a single quiet question that nobody in that meeting fully understood at the time it was asked. He asked simply whether the association's pool complex had only one road leading in and out of the property, and when Mark confirmed that indeed it did, Ethan thanked him politely and ended the call without another word spoken. Nobody thought much of the question in that moment, assuming it was simply idle curiosity from a man they still badly underestimated. The following night, a flatbed truck rumbled quietly down a gravel road toward that same access point, carrying a heavy steel gate that would soon change absolutely everything for everyone involved. The next morning brought total chaos to Sunrise Canyon's pool community before most residents had even finished pouring their morning coffee. The single road connecting the resort area to the outside world was now blocked entirely by a solid steel gate, secured with nothing more than a simple $40 padlock that somehow proved far more powerful than any of the association's expensive legal threats combined. Bright metal signs bolted firmly to the gate declared the road private property, warned sternly against trespassing, and made clear in plain language that this was no misunderstanding but a deliberate, calculated response to everything that had come before. Victoria arrived at the scene furious, ordering a maintenance worker to bring bolt cutters and remove the obstruction immediately, treating the gate as nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be dismissed on site. Before the cutters ever touched the lock, Sheriff Cole Brennan pulled up in his patrol vehicle, having been notified of the disturbance by a concerned neighbor early that morning. He informed Victoria plainly and firmly that cutting a lock on private property constituted destruction of property under the law, and that anyone attempting it would be dealt with accordingly, regardless of their position in the community. With calm but unmistakable authority in his voice, he instructed everyone present to stand down and simply wait, and by mid-morning, more than 80 vehicles sat trapped inside the gated pool community with absolutely no way out at all. Some residents pressed their palms against the hot metal of their car doors, others sat on the curb fanning themselves with folded papers, and a few began recording the scene on their phones purely out of disbelief that any of this was actually happening in their quiet neighborhood. Victoria stood near the gate for nearly an hour, alternating between furious phone calls and awkward reassurances to residents who no longer seemed to believe a word she said. The sheriff, for his part, remained entirely unmoved by her escalating tone, repeating the same calm instruction each time she approached him with a new demand. A retired school teacher among the stranded residents later remarked that watching Victoria argue with the sheriff felt like watching someone try to negotiate with the weather, since neither the law nor the locked gate showed the slightest interest in her frustration. Another resident quietly wondered aloud whether the association's insurance would even cover a dispute born from a mistake this fundamental, a question nobody present had a confident answer for. By early afternoon, several residents had simply given up waiting near their vehicles, and instead sat together in whatever shade they could find, trading theories about how such an expensive project could have been built without anyone bothering to check who actually owned the ground. News of the standoff spread through the surrounding area with surprising speed, carried by curious neighbors, passing drivers, and eventually a local news drone hovering above the scene to capture aerial footage of dozens of stranded cars baking quietly in the Montana sun. Residents grew increasingly frustrated as the hours dragged on, some missing work entirely, others missing important appointments, all of them slowly realizing that their community leadership had led them into a mess with no easy or immediate exit available. Victoria called Mark Dalton in a rising panic, demanding he find some legal maneuver to force the gate open immediately regardless of the cost involved, but what he discovered instead only deepened the unfolding crisis considerably. Digging through property records with real urgency for the first time in this entire process, Mark realized that the access road itself, the only path in or out of the pool complex, also belonged entirely to Ethan Walker without exception. The association had never obtained an easement, never signed any agreement, and never secured any legal right whatsoever to use that road for their private development in the first place. Victoria's confident authority began to crack visibly, for the first time, throughout the entire ordeal, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable dread as she understood just how completely the situation had turned against her and her association. By that evening, the story had reached local television broadcasts, complete with footage of frustrated residents standing beside their overheating vehicles, and a brief statement from the sheriff's department confirming that the matter was now considered a civil property dispute rather than any criminal wrongdoing on Ethan's part whatsoever. Reporters asked pointed, uncomfortable questions about how a homeowners association could spend over $2 million building an entire resort without first confirming who actually owned the underlying land. Victoria, visibly shaken during a brief and hastily arranged interview, insisted that the situation was merely a misunderstanding that would be resolved quickly through the proper legal channels available to them. Behind closed doors, however, board members were already questioning her leadership openly, and residents who had once applauded her ambitious vision now demanded honest answers about how their monthly dues had been spent without their knowledge. Ethan, watching none of the coverage himself, simply continued his usual routine that evening, tending to his cattle and repairing fences as though nothing unusual had happened at all that day. The gate remained locked through the night, the pressure kept steadily building, and the only path forward now ran directly through a courtroom none of them could avoid any longer. Inside the trapped compound, tempers frayed further as the afternoon wore on, with some residents blaming Victoria directly and others insisting the entire disaster could still be resolved quietly if cooler heads simply prevailed. A few attempted to reach Ethan themselves through mutual acquaintances, hoping a private conversation might succeed where Victoria's confrontation had failed so badly. Ethan declined every such request politely, telling each caller the same thing, that any resolution would now have to happen through proper legal channels rather than hurried apologies exchanged over a fence. The Homeowners Association formally filed suit against Ethan Walker not long after, demanding that he unlock the gate immediately and seeking financial compensation for what they characterized publicly as an unreasonable obstruction of their community property. Ethan's attorney arrived at the hearing with a thick stack of documents that told a very different story than the one Victoria had been repeating to her board for weeks. There were certified copies of the original deed passed down through Ethan's family for generations, satellite imagery confirming current boundaries with precise coordinates, and James Miller's signed surveying report establishing beyond any reasonable doubt exactly where the true property lines fell along that ridge. Judge Eleanor Brooks, a woman known throughout the county for her sharp attention to detail and her limited patience for excuses, asked the association's counsel a series of simple, direct questions one after another. She asked whether the association held any documented easement granting access across Ethan's land, and Mark Dalton was forced to admit that they did not hold any such document. She asked whether any usage agreement had ever been signed between the association and Ethan Walker regarding that parcel, and again the answer that followed was no. She asked, finally, whether any formal contract of any kind existed permitting construction on that specific piece of land, and for the third time in a row, the answer that echoed through the quiet courtroom was simply no. The judge said nothing further that day, closing the session with a quiet promise that her written ruling would come soon, leaving the entire association to sit uneasily with the weight of 3 unanswered questions hanging over them. Reporters seated in the gallery took careful notes throughout the hearing, sensing already that this case would become a cautionary tale, repeated for years across similar disputes throughout the region. Mark Dalton, for his part, appeared visibly resigned by the third question, having clearly understood by then that no clever argument could rescue a case built on nothing but assumption and convenience. Ethan sat quietly through the entire proceeding, answering only when directly asked, offering no commentary and no visible satisfaction, even as the evidence mounted overwhelmingly in his favor. At one point during cross-examination, Mark Dalton attempted to argue that decades of neglect on Ethan's part implied a kind of abandonment of the southern acreage, suggesting the association had simply occupied land nobody was actively using. Ethan's attorney countered calmly with tax records proving continuous payment on the entire parcel for every single year on record, along with grazing logs showing regular seasonal use of that same ground going back decades. Judge Brooks noted for the record that unused did not mean unowned, and that ranching operations naturally rotate across large acreage without ever forfeiting legal title to any portion of it. The argument collapsed almost as quickly as it had been raised, and Mark returned to his seat without pressing the point any further for the remainder of the hearing. When Judge Brooks finally delivered her written ruling several days later, she did not soften a single word of it for anyone's comfort. She found that the Homeowners Association had knowingly and repeatedly trespassed upon private property, building an entire commercial-style facility without permission, without a proper survey, and without the most basic legal diligence any responsible organization should have completed long before breaking ground. Her order required the association to demolish the entire pool complex at their own expense, to restore the land to its original natural condition exactly as it had been found, to pay Ethan substantial damages for the unauthorized use of his property over those months, to cover all court costs associated with the litigation from start to finish, and to issue a formal public apology, acknowledging their wrongdoing to the community and to Ethan directly. Victoria was removed from her position as president within days of the ruling becoming public knowledge, her reputation among the residents she once commanded now in complete and irreversible ruin. The contractor, who had assured everyone the land was unclaimed, turned around almost immediately and filed his own lawsuit against the association, seeking payment for work he now argued had been authorized under entirely false pretenses from the start. Residents who had once cheered loudly at the grand opening now gathered in furious meetings demanding accountability for how their dues had funded such a catastrophic and completely avoidable mistake. Not long after the ruling was finalized and made public, Victoria found herself standing quietly at Ethan's front gate for the very first time, no longer wearing the confidence that once defined her every word, asking softly if they might speak. The demolition crews arrived within the month, working in near total silence compared to the celebratory noise that had once filled that same space, tearing down walls and hauling away concrete piece by piece under close supervision. A handful of residents watched from a respectful distance, some quietly relieved that the ordeal was finally ending, others simply grateful the constant news attention would soon fade from their quiet street. Victoria was noticeably absent from every stage of that demolition, unable, it seemed, to watch her once proud vision reduced back to bare, empty earth. Victoria arrived that afternoon, not as the commanding president who once dismissed Ethan with a careless wave of her hand, but as a woman entirely stripped of authority and searching desperately for any way to salvage what little remained of her standing. She offered, somewhat desperately, to have the association simply purchase the disputed acreage outright, believing even now that money alone might still repair what arrogance had so thoroughly broken. Ethan listened patiently to her entire proposal, then told her plainly and without malice that this land was not for sale at any price, since it represented generations of his family's history rather than a simple commercial asset to be traded away. He did, however, offer her one clear path forward, a legal easement granting the association proper, documented access to a road on his property, provided they paid an annual easement fee and signed a binding agreement never to encroach upon his land again under any circumstances. Victoria, left with no better alternative and absolutely no leverage remaining after everything that had happened, had little real choice but to accept the terms exactly as Ethan presented them to her. It was, in many ways, the first time throughout the entire dispute that she had been forced to listen rather than dictate the outcome herself, and the shift in her posture as she signed the papers spoke far louder than any spoken apology ever could have managed. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them carried more weight than any of the arguments exchanged over the previous months combined. Ethan finally added, almost gently, that he held no personal anger toward her or the residents who had simply trusted their leadership without question, since most people never think to doubt a plan presented with such total confidence. Victoria nodded slowly, unable to find any response equal to the moment, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she allowed herself to simply accept a decision rather than fight it. She left his property that evening quieter than she had arrived, glancing back once at the gate before driving away for what would be one of the last times she ever visited that stretch of road at all. Somewhere along that drive home, residents later suspected, Victoria finally understood the difference between confidence and certainty, a lesson that arrived nearly $2 million too late for her association to afford comfortably. Within a year, the transformation of that southern boundary was almost impossible to imagine given what had stood there only months earlier at the height of the dispute. The pool, the bar, the changing rooms, and every trace of the unauthorized resort had been fully removed, and native grasses had been carefully reseeded across the scarred earth until the land slowly began to look like honest pasture again, rather than an abandoned construction site. Victoria moved away from Sunrise Canyon Estates entirely, unable to face neighbors who once trusted her judgment without question and who now viewed her decisions as a cautionary tale repeated at nearly every community gathering held afterward. The association elected an entirely new board that year, one that immediately implemented strict policies, requiring full legal review and independent county verification before any future construction project could even be formally proposed to residents. Sheriff Cole Brennan, driving past Ethan's property not long afterward on routine patrol, stopped briefly to share a few quiet words with the rancher he had come to respect deeply throughout the entire ordeal. He remarked that some people spend their whole lives believing the law bends toward whoever has the most money and the loudest voice in the room, but in the end, the law has always belonged to whoever actually holds the paper proving what is truly theirs. Word of the ruling eventually reached ranchers in neighboring counties, many of whom had faced their own quiet disputes over boundary lines and easements without ever taking the matter to court. Some began keeping more meticulous records after hearing the story, updating old surveys and filing fresh paperwork with the county simply to avoid ever finding themselves in Ethan's position. Others simply repeated the story at gatherings as a reminder that confidence without documentation was worth nothing at all in front of a judge who demanded proof rather than promises. Cattle grazed once more across that southern stretch by the following spring, indistinguishable in most places from land that had never been disturbed at all. Occasionally, a rusted bolt or a fragment of buried tile still surfaced after heavy rain, small reminders of what had briefly stood there, though Ethan never spoke of them when neighbors happened to notice. He simply gathered such fragments quietly and set them aside, treating them less as evidence of victory and more as scraps of a lesson that the land itself seemed determined never to fully forget. Ethan walked out to that same steel gate one final time, the very structure that had trapped 80 vehicles and humbled an entire community in a single unforgettable afternoon. This time, however, he was not there to lock anyone out, but to hand over a newly cut key, one created specifically under the terms of the legal easement now binding both parties in clear, unambiguous writing. He was not doing this because he had grown weak or forgiving out of simple exhaustion, nor because the long fight had worn him down into quiet surrender at last. He did it because he understood something that Victoria and her board had never taken the time to learn throughout the entire ordeal, that ownership of land was never meant to be a weapon for revenge, but a responsibility meant to protect fairness for everyone involved in the community around it. The quiet man who never raised his voice, who never hired an army of lawyers, or spoke a single threatening word throughout the entire dispute, had proven in the end that patience, documentation, and respect for the law would always outlast noise, arrogance, and borrowed confidence built on nothing solid at all. In that small Montana valley, long after the pool was gone and the grass had grown back over every scar, people still remembered that the ones who truly win are rarely the loudest voices in the room, but the ones who simply hold the proof, keep their composure, and wait patiently for the truth to speak entirely for itself. Mark Dalton, for his part, left the association's legal counsel not long after the ruling, telling colleagues privately that he had learned more from losing that single case than from any he had ever won. He began requiring independent title verification on every property matter he handled afterward, a habit he credited entirely to the quiet rancher who never once raised his voice against him. Sheriff Cole Brennan continued patrolling that same stretch of road for years afterward, occasionally pointing out the gate to newer deputies as an example of how a calm, well-documented response could accomplish more than any show of force ever could. Years later, when new residents asked about the strange story behind the steel gate still standing quietly at that southern boundary, longtime neighbors would tell it slowly, almost like a parable passed down rather than a simple local scandal. They spoke of a rancher who never shouted, a president who never checked, and a lock worth only $40 that somehow proved stronger than every lawyer either side ever hired. They spoke, too, of the pool that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and the grass that eventually reclaimed every trace of it, as though the land itself had simply waited out the noise until quiet honesty could return. And whenever someone asked what the real lesson of it all had been, the answer given most often was always the same, that the ground beneath your feet belongs to whoever can prove it, and no amount of confidence, ambition, or champagne poured in celebration will ever change what the paper truly says.